The massive space station called Council Prime floated in the darkness between three bright stars. The structure was so huge that small ships looked like tiny dots flying around it inside the main chamber. Thousands of different creatures from across the galaxy gathered for their monthly meeting. The air buzzed with strange sounds as hundreds of species talked in their own languages. Ambassador Taman sat in a small section marked for humans. His dark eyes looked around the enormous hall, filled with beings that came in every shape and size you could imagine. Some looked like walking crystals that sparkled in the light. Others were made of metal and wires with glowing eyes. Some floated in the air like clouds of colored gas. The humans had only joined this galactic community 50 years ago, and most other species still saw them as the new kids who came from that small blue world far away from the center of everything. Next to Taman sat Captain Sora, who kept checking her electronic tablet. She was reading reports about ships that had gone missing near a star system called Vega. The numbers kept growing every week, but whenever the humans tried to tell the council about it, the older species would just smile and pat them on the head like they were children who didn't understand grown-up things. 3 months ago, Elder Voxtan from the Crystalline Collective had made his body shimmer with colors that meant he was being dismissive. He had told the humans that the Empire knew how to handle space pirates and that human people were too young to understand how things worked in space. The way he said it made it sound like the humans were cute pets trying to help with something too complicated for them, but today felt different than all the other meetings. Timon had been getting urgent messages from Earth Command since early morning. The investigation team led by Commander Jinho had found something in the outer colonies that made even the toughest military soldiers turn pale with fear. The missing ships were not the work of ordinary pirates. They were something much, much worse. The council session began like it did every month, with different species reporting their trade numbers and arguing about who owned which planets. The Vel Empire bragged about their new mining operations that were making them rich. The Synthetic Coalition shared information about their latest computer technology that could think faster than most organic brains. The humans, as usual, were scheduled to speak last if they got to speak at all. Most of the alien species thought humans were interesting but not very important. They came from what everyone called a death world because their planet Earth was full of dangerous, whether deadly animals and diseases that could kill you. The aliens thought this made humans tough, but also primitive, like cave dwellers who had learned to use spaceships. The Krell were talking about their new trade routes when the chamber doors suddenly burst open. Admiral Nari rushed in with her uniform wrinkled and dirt on her boots. Her face looked grim, like someone who had seen terrible things. She walked quickly to where Taman was sitting and whispered something urgent in his ear. Had always been calm and polite in all the previous meetings, but now his expression changed completely. He stood up so fast his chair fell over. The sound echoed through the chamber and everyone stopped talking to look at him. Ambassador Taman raised his voice so everyone could hear him clearly. Council members, we need to discuss the Vega situation right now. This cannot wait. The chamber exploded with angry sounds. Different species made chittering noises, electronic beeps and growling sounds that all meant the same thing. How dare these young humans interrupt important business? The Vel Trade Minister had been in the middle of explaining their profit margins. The Synthetic Coalition was waiting to present their new artificial intelligence systems, but Captain Sora was already moving to the center of the chamber where the main holographic display system was located. She pressed several buttons, and suddenly the air above everyone filled with three-dimensional images that made several council members step backward in shock. The images showed things that looked like they came from the worst nightmares anyone could imagine. Huge space stations had been twisted into impossible shapes, like someone had grabbed them with giant hands and squeezed until the metal bent in ways that metal should not bend. Ships floated dead in space, looking like broken toys that a child had thrown away in anger. But the worst part was that there were no signs of the people who had been living and working in those places. More images appeared, showing something growing across asteroid fields. It looked like a mixture of machines and living tissue pulsing with a sick light that made even the bravest warriors in the chamber feel afraid. Some of the creatures looked like they wanted to throw up. Others started backing toward the exit. Zelda Morketh from the Ancient Ring Coalition began shaking all 6 of his arms. He was one of the oldest beings in the galaxy and had lived for over 2,000 years, but now he looked terrified. His species communicated by making clicking sounds, and he was clicking so fast it sounded like a machine gun note. He whispered in the common galactic language that everyone could understand. They were destroyed. We made sure they were destroyed 3,000 years ago. Commander Jinho stepped forward from where he had been standing quietly near the human section. His face was serious but calm, like a soldier who had seen battle before. Our deep space reconnaissance ships detected the first signs 6 months ago, he said in a steady voice. We have been tracking their expansion pattern ever since. He pointed at the holographic display, which now showed a map of several star systems. Each system was marked with different colored lights. Green meant safe, yellow meant possible danger, and red meant complete disaster. There were far too many red lights spreading across the map like a disease. They are not just back, Commander Jin continued. They are organized and they are learning from their previous defeat. The word hung in the air like a poison cloud. The Devourers were older than most civilizations in the galaxy. They were something that was part machine and part living creature that ate entire worlds and turned planets into breeding grounds to make more of themselves. 3,000 years ago, it had taken 50 different species working together and the sacrifice of countless worlds to stop them. The war had been so terrible that most species had erased the details from their history books, keeping only a simple warning: never again. Hygiene, the human scientist who studied alien life forms, activated another set of images. We have analyzed their new biological signatures, she said in a voice that stayed calm even while showing terrifying pictures. They have evolved. The old weapons will not work anymore. The quantum disruptors that stopped them before, they are immune now. The mental barriers that contained them, they have learned to feed on psychic energy. The council chamber became completely silent. Several representatives were accessing their species' deepest computer files, pulling up records that had not been opened in thousands of years. As they read the ancient files, the horror on their faces grew, like watching someone realize their worst fear was standing right behind them. This is impossible, declared Prime Nexus Velkar, his mechanical voice making electronic glitching sounds that meant he was having trouble processing the information. Our combined fleet's number in the millions. Our technology is far more advanced than it was 3,000 years ago. Ambassador Taman looked around the chamber at all the proud, ancient civilizations that had been ruling the galaxy since before humans had learned to make fire. That is what we thought too, he said quietly, until we sent a full battle fleet to investigate the Kepler system. The hologram changed to show the wreckage of what had once been 300 warships. The ships were not just destroyed, they were torn apart like paper and scattered across space like confetti after a terrible party. Admiral Park led our finest vessels against what we thought was a minor outbreak. Taman continued. None of them came back. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in the huge chamber. These were the same council members who had spent decades telling humanity they were primitive, calling their home world a death world because of its dangerous environment and violent history. Now these same primitive humans were bringing them news of the galaxy's greatest nightmare returning. Captain Sora stepped up to the speaking platform. The difference is, she said in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber, we remember what it takes to fight monsters. The holographic images floating above the council chamber showed scenes that belonged in the worst nightmares, not in real life. Entire space stations had been stripped completely clean, like someone had peeled an orange and thrown away everything useful. The metal holes were twisted into shapes that hurt your eyes to look at because they bent in ways that should not be possible. Ships hung in the empty darkness like broken toys that a giant child had played with too roughly and then forgotten about. But the most terrible thing of all were the biomechanical constructs that were growing like cancer across asteroid fields. These things pulsed with an alien hunger that made even the most battle-hardened species in the galaxy want to run away and hide. The constructs looked like a nightmare mixture of machine parts and living flesh, all tangled together and breathing with a rhythm that was wrong in every way. Something about the way they moved made every instinct in every living being's brain scream danger. Elder Morketh of the Ancient Ring Coalition began trembling so hard that all 6 of his arms wrapped around his body like he was trying to hold himself together. His species had lived for thousands of years and had seen the rise and fall of entire civilizations, but now he looked like a scared child. No, he whispered in his species clicking language that sounded like breaking glass. They were destroyed. We made sure they were destroyed 3,000 years ago. Old Alien was remembering things that his people had tried very hard to forget. Memories that had been locked away in the deepest parts of their historical archives because they were too terrible for normal minds to handle. His clicking became faster and more panicked as the ancient fear came flooding back. Commander Jinho stepped forward from the human delegation. His expression was serious but calm, like a soldier who had seen death before and was not afraid to look it in the face. Our deep space reconnaissance ships detected the first signs 6 months ago, he said in a voice that stayed steady even while showing the most frightening images the galaxy had seen in millennia. We have been tracking their expansion pattern ever since. He gestured to the holographic display, and the image changed to show a 3-dimensional map of space. The map showed dozens of star systems, connected by glowing lines that looked like the veins in a sick body. Each line showed how the infection was spreading from one world to another like a disease that could jump across the emptiness between stars. They not just back. Commander Ho continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had studied an enemy that most people thought was just a scary story told to children. They are organized and they are learning from their previous defeat. The Devourers were older than most civilizations that currently ruled the galaxy. They had been around when the first species were just starting to figure out how to travel between stars. They were a biomechanical plague that consumed entire worlds, eating everything living and turning planets into breeding grounds where they could make more of themselves. 3,000 years ago, it had taken the combined military might of 50 different species and the sacrifice of countless worlds to stop them. The war had been so terrible and so costly that most species had completely erased the details from their historical records. They kept only the simple warning that every schoolchild learned: never again. But apparently again was exactly what was happening right now. Dr. Hyde The human xenobiologist who specialized in studying dangerous alien life forms activated a set of images that made several council members cover their eyes or turn away. "We have analyzed their new biosignatures," she said in a calm, scientific voice that seemed strange when talking about something so terrifying. "They have evolved. The old weapons will not work anymore." The new images showed devourer creatures that looked different from the ancient records. These new ones were bigger, more complex, and seemed to have learned from every species they had fought before. "The quantum disruptors that stopped them 3,000 years ago, they are completely immune to them now," she continued. "The psionic barriers that our ancestors used to contain them, they have learned to feed on psychic energy instead of being stopped by ITX." The council chamber fell into the kind of stunned silence that happens when people realize that their worst nightmare is not only real but is also much worse than they remembered. Several representatives were frantically accessing their species' deepest computer archives, pulling up files that had not been opened for thousands of years. These were files that contained a real history of the first Devourer War, the files that told the truth about how many worlds had been lost, how many billions of beings who had died, and how close the entire galaxy had come to being completely consumed. Most species had hidden these files away because the truth was too horrible for peaceful minds to handle. The horror on their faces grew as they read the ancient reports. It was like watching someone slowly realize that the monster under their bed was not only real but was currently climbing the stairs to their bedroom. "This is impossible," declared Prime Nexus Velkar, his mechanical voice making strange electronic sounds that meant his artificial brain was having trouble processing the information he was receiving. "Our combined fleets number in the millions of ships. Our technology is far more advanced than it was 3,000 years ago. We have weapons that can destroy entire star systems." The synthetic being was trying to use logic and mathematics to make the fear go away. But numbers and statistics do not work against nightmares that have learned to eat mathematics for breakfast. Ambassador Taman looked around the chamber at all the proud ancient civilizations that had been ruling the galaxy for thousands of years. These were species that had built incredible technologies that could reshape reality itself. They had created art and music and literature that could make people weep with beauty. They had solved problems that seemed impossible and had brought peace to countless worlds. "That is what we thought," Taman said in a quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the huge chamber, "until we sent a full battle fleet to investigate what we thought was just a small problem in the Kepler system." The holographic display shifted to show what remained of what had once been Admiral Park's battle fleet. 300 of humanity's finest warships had been reduced to twisted wreckage scattered across space like leaves blown by a hurricane. The ships had not just been destroyed, they had been torn apart and reshaped into forms that made no sense, as if the devourers had been playing with them like a cat plays with a mouse. "Admiral Park lead our finest vessels and our best trained crews against what our intelligence reports said was a minor outbreak," Taman continued, his voice getting quieter but somehow more frightening with each word. "None of them came back. Not a single ship, not a single person, not even a distress signal." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the hum of the space station's life support systems. These were the same council members who had spent decades dismissing humanity as primitive warriors. They had called Earth a death world because of its dangerous environment and violent history. They had treated humans like interesting pets who were tough but not very smart. Now these same primitive humans were the ones bringing them news that their galaxy's greatest nightmare had returned and was stronger than ever before. The irony was not lost on anyone in the chamber. The species that everyone had to look down on were the only ones who had been paying attention to the real dangers. Captain Sora stepped up to the main speaking platform. Her military uniform was crisp and clean, but her eyes held the look of someone who had seen things that would give other people nightmares for the rest of their lives. "The difference is," she said in a voice that was calm but carried an undertone of something that made every predator instinct in the room wake up and pay attention. "We remember what it takes to fight monsters." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Every species in the chamber suddenly realized that they were about to learn lessons that they had spent thousands of years trying to forget, and their teachers were going to be the Death World humans that they had always thought were too primitive to understand civilized warfare. The emergency session had been going for 18 hours straight without any breaks. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy were present, and some were attending virtually from their home worlds through quantum communication links that allowed them to appear as holograms. The chamber that usually hosted polite trade negotiations and diplomatic discussions now felt like a military war room, with tactical displays showing the advancing devourer infestation spreading across 12 different star systems like a plague. General Wu Jin stood before the assembled council members. His weathered face showed the kind of calm that only comes from surviving situations that should have killed you many times over. Behind him, detailed battle plans rotated in three-dimensional space marked with symbols and strategies that made many of the peaceful species feel uncomfortable just looking at them. The plans looked like something designed by people who understood that war was not a game but a bloody business where the losers died horribly. "Most of you have lived on paradise worlds for thousands of years. He began speaking in a voice that was steady and matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. Your planets have perfect climate control, no dangerous predators, no natural disasters that could kill you. You have forgotten what it means to fight for survival every single day of your life. The general gestured to a holographic display that showed various alien homeworlds. Each one looked like a perfect garden with beautiful cities, gleaming towers, and peaceful landscapes where nothing bad ever happened. The technology on these worlds controlled everything from the weather to the growth of plants, so that life was always comfortable and safe. The celestial harmony representative, who was a floating being made of pure energy, pulsed with colors that showed indignation. We have evolved beyond such primitive concerns. Violence is not the answer. To every problem there must be diplomatic solutions that do not require bloodshed. Dar Young-soo, the human military historian who had spent his life studying how wars were fought, and one stepped forward with a grim smile that did not reach his eyes. Earth teaches you that everything wants to kill you, he said in a voice that made several aliens step backward. The weather can freeze you to death or cook you alive. The animals see you as food. The plants can poison you with a single touch even. The bacteria in the air wants to eat you from the inside out. He activated a holographic display that showed Earth in all its chaotic, dangerous glory. Unlike the sterile perfection of most civilized worlds, Earth was a wild mess of competing life forms, extreme weather patterns that could change without warning, and geological instability that could split continents in half. Massive storms raged across oceans while volcanoes spewed molten rock into the sky and earthquakes shook the ground. Beneath your feet, humans did not get to the top of our food chain by being peaceful and reasonable. Dr. Young-soo continued, we got there by being better at violence than everything else that wanted to eat us. We learned to hunt creatures that would bigger, stronger, and faster than us. We learned to survive in places that would kill most other species in minutes. The display showed scenes from Earth's history, humans fighting massive predators with nothing but simple tools, humans surviving ice ages that lasted for thousands of years, humans crossing dangerous oceans and climbing deadly mountains just to see what was on the other side. Every image showed the same thing, a species that refused to give up no matter how bad things got. We call Earth a death world because it tries to kill us every single day, he said, and that has made us very, very good at staying alive. When everything goes wrong, Commander Yuna took over the presentation with the efficiency of someone who had spent years turning theory into practical battle plans. The Devourers are not just another enemy you can negotiate with or outsmart with superior technology, she explained while showing tactical analyses of recent Devourer attacks. They are a force of nature. Like a hurricane or a volcanic eruption, you do not reason with a tsunami. You prepare for it, you adapt to it, and you fight it with everything you have. The holographic displays showed how the Devourers moved and attacked. It was not like normal warfare, where armies had strategies and goals. The Devourers simply consumed everything in their path like a wildfire burning through a forest. They did not care about surrender or negotiation. They only understood hunger and growth. They have grown stronger by consuming peaceful civilizations. First Commander Yuna continued. Your worlds are easy targets because you have never had to develop real defensive instincts. Your people do not know how to fight because you have never needed to learn, but they made a mistake when they attacked our outer colonies. The hologram shifted to show the Battle of New Busan, where a single human colony had held off a massive Devourer assault for 3 weeks using nothing but mining equipment, farming tools, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from being raised on a world that never stops trying to kill you. 17,000 colonists, she said, mostly farmers and engineers who had never been soldiers, killed over 2 million Devourer forms before our military reinforcements could arrive. They used explosives meant for mining to collapse tunnels on enemy formations. They turned agricultural chemicals into weapons. They fought with their bare hands when they ran out of ammunition. Images showed ordinary people doing extraordinary things, farmers who had learned to repair broken equipment in hostile environments, using that knowledge to build improvised weapons, engineers who understood how to work in dangerous conditions, adapting those skills to create deadly traps, teachers and doctors and shopkeepers, standing shoulder to shoulder with mining crews as they held defensive positions against waves of biomechanical nightmares. Lev Ezxnin of the Synthetic Coalition processed this information with electronic confusion that made his mechanical parts spark. This level of casualty acceptance is beyond our programming parameters. How do organic beings function with such statistical disadvantages when logic suggests immediate retreat? Captain Minho, who had survived the New Busan siege and still carried scars from fighting biomechanical creatures with his bare hands, laughed with a kind of dark humor that comes from seeing the worst things imaginable and somehow living through them. Because we are too stupid to know when we are beaten, he said, and too angry to care about the odds. When something tries to eat your children, you do not run calculations about your chances of survival. You pick up the biggest weapon you can find and you fight until either you are dead or the thing trying to hurt your family is dead. Human military leaders began outlining their strategy for fighting the Devourers. It was not pretty and it was not sophisticated, like the elegant battle plans that civilized species preferred. It was the kind of brutal, grinding warfare that peaceful species had spent thousands of years trying to avoid. But as the tactical projections showed, it was also the only approach that had any realistic chance of working against an enemy that could not be reasoned with. "We can teach you how to fight like Death Worlders," General Wu Jin concluded, "but you need to understand what that means. It means accepting losses that will horrify you. It means making sacrifices that go against everything your peaceful cultures value. It means becoming the kind of monsters that can hunt other monsters." The chamber fell silent as the terrible implications sank in like poison. The choice was simple but horrible: learn to be savage like the humans, or watch the entire galaxy burn while they tried to negotiate with creatures that only understood hunger. The representatives looked at each other with growing understanding. They had always thought the humans were primitive because they came from a dangerous world. Now they realized that danger had been the greatest teacher the galaxy had ever produced. 6 months after the emergency council session, the galaxy had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the peaceful civilizations that had existed before. The Devourers returned to trade routes that had carried luxury goods and cultural exchanges for thousands of years were now military supply lines carrying weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies to worlds that were learning how to become fortresses paradise. Worlds that had never seen violence were being converted into military bases with weapon systems that could destroy entire fleets. Training facilities were being built where species that had not fought a war in millennia were learning how to use weapons, designed by humans who understood that sometimes survival required becoming something terrible that your ancestors would not recognize. On the bridge of the massive battleship Soul's Vengeance fleet, Admiral Lena watched through the main viewing screen as the combined galactic fleet approached the Devourer stronghold in the Altair system. The fleet was enormous, stretching across space like a metal constellation, but everyone knew that size alone would not be enough to win this battle. Around Admiral Lena, officers from dozens of different species worked side by side at control stations. Their various forms of communication created a symphony of clicks, hums, electronic signals, and other sounds as they coordinated what historians would later call the largest military operation in galactic history. The bridge was a mixture of technologies from hundreds of worlds all working together. For the first time, the Crystalline Collective had learned to weaponize their natural ability to focus light, turning their bodies into devastating laser arrays that could cut through enemy armor like paper. The Synthetic Coalition had overcome their programming limitations against violence by redefining the Devourers as a computer virus that needed to be eliminated from the galactic system. Even the peaceful celestial harmony had contributed to the war effort by learning to channel their energy forms into destructive plasma bursts that could overload enemy biomechanical systems. The beings of pure energy had never imagined they would use their abilities to cause destruction, but desperate times had taught them that sometimes destruction was the only way to preserve what you loved. But the real change was visible in their eyes, sensors, and optical clusters. These beings who had spent generations living in perfect peace now carried the hard look of soldiers who had seen too much death and knew they would see more before the war was over. Their innocence had been burned away in the fires of necessity. Lieutenant Colonel Dongwu reviewed the casualty reports from the recent battles leading up to this final assault. The numbers were staggering and got worse every time he looked at them. Entire fleets had been lost in the fighting against the Devourers. Planets that had stood peaceful and beautiful for thousands of years were now radioactive wastelands that had been sacrificed to stop the Devourer advance from reaching the core worlds. The Vel Empire alone had lost 60% of their population in the desperate defense of their home systems. Billions of beings who had never known anything but peace and prosperity had died learning how to fight an enemy that showed no mercy and took no prisoners. The cost of survival was being measured in the destruction of everything these civilizations had spent millennia building. The Harmony delegation is requesting permission to withdraw their remaining forces, reported Communications Officer Bioram, her voice carefully neutral even though everyone who could hear the strain. They say the psychological trauma is causing permanent damage to their collective consciousness, and they may not recover even if we win this war. Admiral Lena nodded grimly because she had expected this request. The peaceful species were discovering that war came with costs that went far beyond simple death and destruction. This was the price that humans had tried to warn them about. Death Worlds did not just teach you how to fight, they taught you that fighting came with psychological costs that peaceful minds could barely comprehend. Haienwu, the human psychologist who had been assigned to help other species cope with combat stress, had been working around the clock trying to keep alien minds from completely breaking under the pressure. Their minds are not built for this kind of sustained violence, he had explained to the Admiral during their daily briefings. Humans process trauma differently because we have been dealing with it for our entire evolutionary history, he continued. Our brains have built-in mechanisms for handling extreme stress and violence because we evolved on a world where those things happened every day. These peaceful species are experiencing psychological damage that might take generations to heal even if they survive. The war, the final battle, began as the combined galactic fleet engaged the Devourer bioships in the outer edges of the Altair system. The enemy had grown even stronger since their return, incorporating technology and biological matter from dozens of consumed species into their ever-evolving forms. They moved through space like living nightmares, tentacles of metal and flesh reaching out to drag ships into their consuming mass. The Devourers did not fight like normal enemies with strategies and tactics. They simply tried to consume everything they could reach, turning captured ships and crew members into more biomechanical horror that could be used against the remaining defenders. It was like fighting a disease that grew stronger every time it infected someone new. But the galactic forces were no longer the same beings who had first fled in terror. 6 months ago, when the Devourers returned, they had learned to fight with a ferocity that would have shocked and horrified their peaceful ancestors, who had thought violence was something that civilized beings had evolved beyond. Crystalline warriors deliberately shattered their own bodies against enemy hulls to create breaches that boarding parties could use to get inside and plant explosives. Synthetic ships overloaded their own power cores to create massive explosions that could take out entire clusters of devourer bioforms. Energy beings poured themselves into enemy computer systems, burning out their own existence in order to cause critical system failures that would cripple the biomechanical constructs. The battle lasted for 48 hours of continuous fighting with no breaks and no mercy shown by either side. Space became filled with the wreckage of thousands of ships from both sides. The vacuum was lit up with weapons fire that could be seen from planets light years away. In the end, it took the sacrifice of over half the galactic fleet, but the Altair stronghold finally fell under the combined assault. The remaining Devourer forces scattered toward the outer rim of the galaxy, broken but not completely destroyed. They would need time to recover and rebuild, but the immediate threat to the core worlds had been stopped as the exhausted survivors regrouped among the floating wreckage. Admiral Lena looked out at the debris field that had once been ships full of living beings from hundreds of different worlds. The cost of victory was scattered across by space in the form of twisted metal and the dreams of civilizations that had learned too late what it meant to fight for survival. Is this what it means to be human? Asked Elder Kexler of the Harmony, his energy form flickering with exhaustion and trauma that might never fully heal. To carry this darkness inside you forever. The Admiral was quiet for a long moment before responding as she watched rescue ships searching through the wreckage for any survivors who might still be alive in the ruins of their vessels. This is what it means to survive when the universe wants you dead, she finally said. And now you understand why death worlds create the kinds of people who can do what needs to be done when everything else fails. 10 years had passed since the Second Devourer War ended, and the galaxy bore scars that would take centuries to heal, but somehow it had survived. The most important thing was that the galaxy had learned lessons that peaceful civilizations had never wanted to learn but could no longer afford to ignore. Ambassador Taman, now considerably older and bearing the quiet weight of someone who had watched civilizations rise and fall, stood before the new Galactic Defense Council. The chamber had been rebuilt larger and stronger than before, with representatives from nearly twice as many species as the old council had contained. But these were not the same naive beings who had once dismissed human warnings about ancient threats lurking in the dark between stars. The memorial wall is complete, reported Director Ju Young as she gestured toward the massive holographic display that now dominated one entire wall of the chamber. Millions of names scrolled past in hundreds of different languages, representing every being who had died in the war against the Devourers. The names moved slowly enough that you could read them if you wanted to remember someone specific, but fast enough that watching them all would take days. 2,300 million casualties across 437 worlds. She continued reading from her official report. The numbers were so large that most minds could not really understand what they meant, but they represented something more important than simple loss. They represented the price that peaceful civilizations had paid to learn what Deathworld species knew instinctively. Commander Sora, now wearing the insignia of Supreme Military Coordinator, presented the annual threat assessment to the assembled representatives. Long-range scout ships report no significant Devourer activity in the past 18 months, she said while displaying tactical maps of the Outer Rim territories. The survivors appear to have retreated beyond the galactic edge, possibly to recover and evolve even further. The assembled representatives listened with the kind of serious attention that had once been reserved only for major trade disputes and territorial negotiations. War had taught that ignoring unpleasant realities could cost them everything they held dear, including their lives, their worlds, and their entire way of life. Dr. Seijin, now the head of the new Xenological Threat Assessment Division, stood to address the council with information that would have been dismissed as paranoid fantasy before the war. We have identified 17 other potential existential threats in our historical databases, she announced while activating displays that showed various regions of space marked with different colored warning indicators and ancient enemies that our predecessors believed were completely destroyed. She continued, anomalous phenomena that could destabilize entire sectors of space, and technological hazards that peaceful species have never had to consider because they assumed such things could never happen to them. The display showed various galactic regions marked with threat levels ranging from yellow caution to red extreme danger. It was a sobering reminder that the Devourers had not been the only nightmare hiding in the dark corners of the galaxy waiting for the right moment to emerge and threaten everything that lived and breathes. The humans have a saying, Dr. Sejin continued, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. We can no longer afford to assume that peace will last forever or that our current safety means we will always be safe. The universe is full of things that want to kill us and we must be ready to fight them. The Synthetic Coalition. Military Representative Unit Prime Alpha 7 spoke with electronic precision that had been modified to include tactical subroutines that would have been considered too aggressive for peacetime programming. Human tactical doctrine has been integrated into all major fleet protocols. Defensive installations now incorporate Death World survival strategies. We estimate our combat effectiveness has increased by 400% since pre-war baseline measurements, but it was Elder Yilnex of the Crystalline Collective who spoke the words that had become the galaxy new motto and the promise that every species had sworn to keep. Never again will we be caught unprepared. Never again will we dismiss warnings from those who understand darkness. Never again will peace make us weak. The phrase had been carved into monuments on thousands of worlds, spoken in classrooms, where young beings learned about the war their elders had fought and won at such terrible cost, and inscribed on the hulls of the new defense fleets that patrolled the galaxy borders looking for threats that might be approaching from the unknown regions of space. General Tazing, the human officer who now commanded the integrated galactic military, stood for the closing ceremony of the annual remembrance. His uniform was decorated with honors from dozens of different species, and his eyes held the look of someone who had seen the worst things the universe could offer and had somehow found the strength to keep fighting. Humanity did not want to teach the galaxy how to wage war, he said in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber. We wanted to join a peaceful community and leave our violent past behind us. We dreamed of a future where our children would never have to learn how to kill or be killed. He paused and looked around the chamber at beings from species that had learned to carry weapons, accept casualties, and make the hard choices that their ancestors had spent thousands of years trying to avoid. But when the choice came between staying pure and staying alive, we chose survival, he continued. And we taught you that sometimes the price of civilization is the willingness to become uncivilized when it is necessary to protect what you love. As the session ended, Ambassador Tamin walked slowly to the memorial wall and placed his weathered hand against the smooth surface that displayed the endless list of names. Somewhere in that constantly scrolling display were friends, colleagues, and strangers who had died so that others could continue to live and build and dream. The galaxy had survived, but it would never be the same. The innocence was gone forever, replaced by the hard knowledge that safety required constant vigilance and that peace was something you had to fight for rather than something you could simply assume would always exist outside the council chamber. Ships from dozens of worlds prepared for another patrol of the Outer Rim territories. Their crews were trained in tactics that once would have horrified their peaceful ancestors. The galaxy had learned the lesson that Death Worlds taught. Sometimes the price of civilization is the willingness to become uncivilized when the alternative is extinction. The humans had given the galaxy a warning that had ultimately saved it from complete destruction. Now that warning had become a promise carved in stone and written in the stars. Across thousands of worlds, never again. The two words meant more than just a memorial. To the dead, they were a commitment to remember the cost of unpreparedness and a vow to never again let peace make them so weak that they could not defend what they had built. The galaxy had learned that survival sometimes required becoming something your ancestors would not recognize, but it was better to be alive and changed than to be dead and pure. In the end, the Death World humans had not just saved the galaxy, they had taught it how to save itself.